as the recipient. And my point when I speak to interdisciplinary audiences is always that at any of these points, decisions and behavior are absolutely crucial. And I always think about psychology as the science of decisions and behavior. And decisions and behaviors are central not just for the general public, that's also a misunderstanding I often get asked about. It's all actors, so retailers making a decision on their packaging systems, etc. The other important point to make is that we as psychologists, we tend to focus on the behavior of individuals and of groups. And it's really important to say these are constrained by the existing system. If you're an environmental psychologist, you're trained in that thinking. But again, often I hear, you psychologists, you just focus on individual behaviors. You don't really think about the challenges people have in their daily life when, for example, there are no options for reusing plastic or using a different sort of packaging. And it's really important to say very clearly it's both, and we need to make it work from the system point of view and also from the individual and the community point of view. So we need joined up solutions. And there are different mechanisms of change. There are bottom-up mechanisms where someone, a local leader, makes some decisions, gets a group of people together. There are some grassroots initiatives that are very powerful. And there are also top-down changes where the law changes or the supermarkets decide to phase out things. And my view, our view is that they work best if they come together. So you've got a force from the bottom up and from the top down. And so that's just a general sort of introduction to our systems thinking. And if you're a psychologist, you're well aware of the drivers of decisions and behavior. So just very, very briefly, we need behavioral options for psychological factors to become important. If there are no behavioral options, people can't change their decisions, can't change their behaviors. And I've just put some of the core ones on this slide. I won't explain them in detail. I think you'll recognize them. Also, just to point out quickly that knowledge on its own is not a very powerful driver of behavior. This is something we know from health psychology, for example. It's not something many people think about carefully, especially as you venture outside of psychology. So that's a point worth making as well. But hopefully this slide is not a surprise. It's a very selective, a very brief selection of factors that matter. So we've been thinking about it for a while, and a few years ago we wrote a paper on, sort of position paper on how to deal with this in the context of plastic pollution. I'm just highlighting this here. And some of the things we said in here for an interdisciplinary audience, again, to psychologists should be fairly familiar. It's important to think about intrinsic rather than just extrinsic motivation. When I talk to people from other disciplines, they often talk about incentives, other extrinsic drivers. And to me, it's really important to think about the intrinsic drivers as well. And one thing, for example, could be ocean connectedness, but similar to what Matt said earlier. So the sense of passion, of wonder about the ocean as a very intrinsic driver for people wanting to protect the ocean from plastic. And we also put in a few more sort of challenging ideas. So for example, we said one of the problems is that the drivers and the consequences are disconnected. How do we achieve that someone in the supermarket making a purchasing decision thinks about the marine impacts or the natural impacts of some of these materials? Here's an idea. We put this in the paper. Of course, I'm not sure you would find producers who would readily put these sorts of pictures on their products. But nevertheless, it was meant as a thought experiment, as sort of, thinking, how can we connect these things? So that as an overall framework is a sort of thought piece where we started from. And I want to start with this idea of ocean connectedness as this sense of subjective wonder, of being part of the ocean, of feeling very connected, of having emotional affinity with the ocean. And we used a measure of this that was very much built on nature connectedness in a study by PhD student Sylvie Nurjua, where we connected ocean connectedness with product responses. So this idea that we can make a link between how someone feels about the ocean and their choices, their decisions about products. So we measured ocean connectedness by self-report, and then we basically had an experimental scenario study where we showed people different types of single-use plastic single-use drinks containers, different materials, plastic, glass, metal, and Tetra Pak. And these had either a recyclable or non-recyclable symbol. And we said to people, you're in a new country, a new context where you don't know the recycling system. So it was a hypothetical vignette task. And it was an unfamiliar brand, which we hoped would reduce any preference effects. We did 2 studies. I'm only going to talk about the second study, which is a general public sample in the UK. And we measured a few different variables. Our main one was willingness to buy this single-use product, but we also had some emotion measures. I'm only going to show the willingness to buy today, because there isn't that much time. And the main finding, the strong finding that we have here is that it really matters how high your ocean connectedness was. So on the left-hand side, those were people with low ocean connectedness. It didn't really matter to them whether the drinks container was recyclable or non-recyclable. Very similar willingness to buy. On the right-hand side, you've got the people high in ocean connectedness, and they really, really mattered. They liked the recyclable, they disliked the non-recyclable. So people with high ocean connectedness told us they were more willing to buy recyclable packaging and less willing to buy single-use packaging. Of course, this is a correlational study. We measured ocean connectedness and then correlated it essentially with their decisions. Question is, what can we say about causality? The age-old question in psychology. I can't show you any results, but I can show you, illustrate a bit what Sophie's been working on since then. So she's been trying to think about how we could induce ocean connectedness. I mean, Matt earlier talked about nature documentaries. I think that's a very interesting angle of doing this. She was using virtual reality in a lab context. So she had this headset and she showed people certain stimuli from the Blue, which is a professionally developed virtual reality series. And I'll just show you a few of these. It actually works really well if you do this. It's very immersive. It's amazing actually to be underwater like this and be able to look around, and the fish respond to your hand when you reach out and so on. Here's another example. So you stand on this ledge. We also played around with this one, which people I think weren't so sure about because the jellyfish were not necessarily positive. Now I'm saying I can't show you any results on this yet because Sophie was developing this. And then Corona hit and she had to delay everything. And then she was allowed to restart. It was all very slow because under Corona protocols. So watch this space. I'm sure she will present some of this data soon. From this lab study, which is more hypothetical, it's not the real context and so on, I wanted to show you one other study we did a few years ago, which was in the field. So here we had the chance to work in a big office building. People in that office building, it's a large consultancy, they wanted to do something about their waste management, and they invited us to come in and play with the signage essentially. So I've put the method here on this slide. It's a big building of 8 floors, approximately 100 employees on each. And what we did was randomly allocate the floors to different conditions. There were 4 conditions in total, and those are illustrated here. Top left, we had improved signage. So they were just interested. This is a classic information intervention. If we improve the signage about where people should put things, does that somehow help the plastics usage? Then we had a signage and pledge where people were asked to sign their commitment to reducing plastic and separating waste better. That's the top right. Then the one condition that I'm particularly interested in, remember the paper I showed you earlier, where we said this is a bit unrealistic to put these poor marine animals on a drinks bottle as you're about to buy it. This is a bit more realistic because this is the point of decision when you dispose of something. So a bit more realistic in the sense that there's no vested interest, you're not reducing consumption or something, you're just trying to get people to do the right thing at disposal and maybe make them think about the materials they use. So signage and animal, that was the one that I was particularly interested in. And the bottom right, you see the control group. So this was a lot smaller, a lot less visible, and we compared with that. So we did this, we implemented this over 9 weeks with a baseline intervention and a post period and several observations every week. And the dependent variable in this case was a real behavioral indicator. We counted plastic items in the bins. So the dependent variable was the percent of plastic items in all items. That was the best we could do at the time. But it's quite exciting because it gives us a real objective indicator. And the other interesting thing is that the colleagues I was working with, they were particularly keen on the pledge condition, whereas I'm obviously both keen on the animal condition. So I'll show you just the main result. This is the percentage of plastic summarized across baseline, intervention, and post-intervention. And what you can hopefully see is in the signage plus animal condition, the orange one, we found a drop from baseline to intervention. And that drop remained just about in the post-intervention period, which was 2 weeks, if I remember right. So that's quite exciting to me. There seems to be a real way of connecting the potential impacts of plastic use in a setting where people make decisions. And interestingly, it doesn't seem to relate directly to the separation of waste, but it seems to be a reduction of waste completely. We also analyzed by bins to see if there was a difference. There was no clear patterns if you separate it into recycling bins, general waste, etc. So this is quite exciting because it's basically this idea that a visual highlighting the impact, highlighting the damage this can do, can have an impact in the real situation. Fieldwork is messy. You'll also see that at baseline, there's quite a lot of variation. There was actually a significant difference at baseline. I've never seen a field study, I think, where that wasn't the case. But the key thing is relative to this baseline, we found a drop. And if you're wondering why we found a general reduction in plastics use independent of bins, we think it's possibly because we applied the pictures to every bin. So it wasn't the case that we said, you know, if you do this as a happy animal in the recycling, above the recycling bins, for example, it's possible that people just took away the general feeling plastic is bad and then adjusted their behavior. But because it's a nice objective study where we only have observational data, we didn't talk to people in depth, we can't test this. So there's a disadvantage of self-report. It's often criticized. What does it really tell us? Is it really related to real behavior? But in this case, we have objective behavior that we can't fully explain. Nevertheless, very exciting. And if I just summarize how we think this works, here's a hypothetical, a conceptual picture of how we think this works. And I feel really bad about the stalk. I feel always bad when I use this picture, but it just highlights the problem. So we have a very strong visual that highlights the impact on the environment. And if you think about the cognitive emotional processes, you have this immediate reaction where the viewer should think, oh, that's really awful. I ought to be more careful. So it's directly linked to a behavioral tendency. And the problem with many interventions is that this immediate response is powerful, but then it disappears. People are basically, they do other things. They don't remember this. But with the visual image, we believe that it has a life of its own. So it comes back. It's very vivid. It's got emotions attached to it. So it's possible if then the person prepares for a shopping trip or prepares to get some lunch, the picture pops up and it triggers the same positive behavior. So avoiding plastic. Must remember to take my own bags. That looked terrible. Or perhaps a person sees a plastic bag in the environment, going a bit beyond this particular study. Maybe I'll pick that up before it does more damage. Again, with the visual image being the driver of this. And the end result of this should be reduced plastic waste. And this is adapted from some work we did around energy visualizations. But this particular process has not been tested yet. So I want to end the discussion today, the presentation today, with a few thoughts about where we do our research. So these two examples I've shown you were from the UK example, in a Canadian context. And I think it's super important to think a bit more broadly. And I know many of you are interested in this. I can see some colleagues, as Artaya earlier, from projects we've worked on. For example, the Blue Communities project in Southeast Asia. I think it's super important to question our models and our assumptions. I mean, there's always this, psychology has this ambition to say this is a general process, we can apply it anywhere. And I think that's really worth investigating and focusing a bit more on other contexts. So can we readily apply our thinking in very different contexts where perhaps people have very different challenges? We talked about the system earlier. In Southeast Asia, in many locations, you have a problem of waste management. There are no good waste management systems. So what do people do? They try to find their own solutions. In some places, you have to pay extra for waste management. Some people can't afford it. So I'm just opening up a bit, be interested in your thoughts here. And I just want to show you one example from some research we did in the Philippines in this case, which also relates to a question I often get asked, which asks, how important is it actually to worry about plastic pollution? Aren't there many other issues we need to worry about much more? And that's exactly what we tried to look at in this particular study. So we asked people about a range of different threats to the marine environment. So this project was about managing the marine environment. So we asked them about different threats. Plastic was one of them. I also want to say this is a sample in Palawan, it's an island in the Philippines, different ages, different genders, and ethnic groups. And they were quite low in annual income. So more than 50% had less than 154 US dollars income per month. So these are people who live subsistency lives. They live from the marine environment. They get their food from the marine environment. So they just have a different perspective from, I don't know, someone who lives in a big city. And what you can see is that the amount of plastics was a concern. This is showing whether the amount of plastics in the environment is getting worse compared to 10 years ago, and whether it will be worse in 10 years. And you can see that it's both. So it's worse now than it was 10 years ago, and people are expecting it to get worse. But overall, in the sort of in the context of the other problems, it's not the worst problem for this particular sample. So wild shellfish and wild fish is more of a concern, and the amount of sewage is also a concern because there isn't good sewage treatment in this particular island. On the other hand, we also see it's not all negative. So this particular sample told us there are some really good things. Mangroves are growing. We think there are more mangroves than there were 10 years ago. We think there will be more mangroves in the future. And seagrass is looking positive as well. So I wanted to show you this slide to start a discussion around how we apply our methods. This was a fairly traditional psychology study, just implemented with local colleagues. But also to say, we need to not forget about other problems people are facing. And if you're interested in that sort of thing, we've got a new project now underway in Indonesia, where again, we work with a big interdisciplinary and international group. And our work package looks at social and behavioral drivers of change, again, in the context of plastic pollution. And Kaylee Wiles at the University of Plymouth has taken this over as the lead, but I'm still involved. So there should be some results coming from that soon. I have one final slide, actually, no, two slides, but this is just a slide. I mean, a theme of this series seems to be, how do we get our results heard? How do we get them to make a difference? And it's been quite exciting because I got drawn into some policy work over the last few years. It started with the GESAMT, that's the joint expert group of experts working in the green environment, who were doing a big report on microplastics. Now that's about as far as I ever thought in my psychology career I could go into the environment. So most of that is about the scientific results, natural scientists measuring microplastics, economists thinking about the problems to the economy and so on. But they were also interested in risk perception and in behavior. Actually, they were more interested in risk perception. I convinced them they also needed to include something on behavior in part 2. And that was really exciting to just see this very different perspective that policymakers have. So they're really interested in the national level, which is a problem for most psychologists because we don't generally have national level data. And they're really interested in the sort of incentives and the policy instruments. And I had to think very carefully, how does what I do feed into these demands? The other thing I found was that they often throw social and economic disciplines into the same pot. So it's always about socioeconomic consequences. And that's not exactly my expertise. They are interested in behavior as well, but this is only a relatively recent thing where they ask about nudges and that sort of behavioral. But anyway, this was quite exciting to provide some input, and from that it developed into a report for the EU, which is in the middle there, Scientific Perspective on Microplastics, and that was now already named Nature and Society, reflecting the natural and the social sciences. And that was a huge step forward because we had both given equal weight almost. I mean, our evidence is much worse than that in the natural sciences, but they understood that and they were open-minded about it. And then from that, we also did some work for the UN. And I love thinking about this context. I love thinking about how we as psychologists can actually say something that's of worth to the policymakers, which isn't just you need to ban plastic, you need to put incentives in place or make plastic a lot more expensive. There are many other ways, other measures, other interventions we can think about to help the effect to reduce plastic pollution. Now, I think I'm pretty much at the end. So I just want to end with a few key messages. As you probably guessed by now, I think human decisions and behaviors are at the core of plastic pollution. Really important that we focus on those, the principles underlying those. And we can look at the psychological and social factors specifically to explain what people do and also inform intervention. Really key to say it's not the fault or the responsibility of individual consumers. And there are some other social sciences that often, well, not often, sometimes have vocalized quite fierce criticism to say, yeah, you psychologists, you just tell us it's the consumer's fault, the consumers needs to solve it. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm saying it's part of a bigger picture. The other thing that sometimes gets forgotten is that interventions need to be evaluated well, and that includes negative side effects. It also includes co-benefits, and that's important in all societies, in all cultural contexts. Because sometimes you think you're doing something good, and then suddenly you find that the end result is much worse, like the carbon footprint is much, much bigger. And then it's quite difficult to have this discussion. What do we focus on? What's the priority? But that's also super important. And research needs to consider diverse communities and be sensitive to different contexts. So we need to work together, share the responsibility. And that's just a thank you to the great people who I've been working with, been lucky enough over the past years. Thanks.